thank you very much for your attendance. We've got a few seconds before we start. And let's make this fun and interactive. So with that, I would like to thank all of our attendees who are joining us. And I'll start out by saying hello and welcome to the International Gaming Standards Association webinar. My name is Mark Pace and I'm the Managing Director of GSA Europe. These webinars are based on the topics that are covered in the Conversations YouTube video series. You can access those Conversations videos by clicking on the YouTube logo that's at the bottom right of the main IGSA.org website page. Again, I would like to start by thanking our panelists for taking the time to participate in this webinar that's going to focus on GSA standards from a regulatory perspective. We have a great panel comprised of regulators and independent testing lab representatives, and I'm sure this is going to be a really great webinar. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A button, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom window, and just type in your question. If you wish to ask it of a specific panelist, please identify that panelist in your question and we'll address it. We do have some GSA staff that are monitoring the questions. As they come in, we might either address them in line or they'll group them by topic and then we'll address them at the end of the webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on the same IGSA.org website by clicking again on that YouTube icon of the main page. GSA is very grateful to these panelists who very generously agreed to share their gaming industry experience and of course their time with us. So I'll ask each one to give a short bio of themselves after I introduce them. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. In alphabetical order, from the Ohio Casino Control Commission, Mr. Chris Fleenor, who is the Manager of Compliance and Gaming. Chris, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on here. So a little bit about myself, computer science major out of college. I've been in gaming for around 15 years now, a little less than 15 years. I began my gaming journey in Missouri with one of the other panelists here, coincidentally. And after working there for a few years, I decided to jump over and take a stab at opening a brand new jurisdiction in Ohio, and haven't left yet.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Next up from BMM Test Labs, Mr. Travis Foley, who's the Chief Operations Officer. Hello, Travis.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for allowing me to participate today. Travis Foley, I was born in, no, I'm not going to go that far back. My history in the gaming industry is I was at the Nevada Gaming Control Board for about 13 and a half years in the technology division there, and I jumped over to BMM and have been involved in BMM for almost 10 years now in various roles, and now the Chief Operations Officer.
Wow, it's been 10 years already. Amazing how time flies.
Yeah,
it's crazy. Thank you, welcome. From the Missouri Gaming Commission, Mr. Todd Nelson, who is the Electronic Gaming Device Manager. Hello, Todd.
How are you doing, Mark? I've been working at the Missouri Gaming Commission for approximately 20 years. I've had a lot of help along the way, people like Chris and some of the other staff members do very well around here. You know, I've been an integral part in developing and creating the EGD program that we have here in Missouri and administering the rules.
Welcome. Thank you very much. And last, I guess, with a surname like Wolff, you're used to going towards the end. From Gaming Labs International, Mr. Pierre Wolff, Director of Global Technical Compliance.
Hey, Mark, thanks. It's funny, my kids always say the same thing. Hey, how come we always got picked last? So I started GLI, just a quick intro. I started GLI 2008, was a test engineer for just about 8.5 years. Lottery systems, protocols, all different kind of interop testing. Moved over to compliance. Early 2019 was promoted to director of compliance. And now I'm responsible for overseeing just about 35 engineers globally and get to work with regulators and be part on these cool panels and discussions. So I'm glad to be here.
That's great. Well, thank you, gentlemen, again. And without further ado, let's get into it. So, Chris, I guess I'll start with you. Before we actually start talking about specific standards, can you tell us a little bit about why the Ohio Casino Control Commission decided to participate in GSA's regulatory committee, and sort of maybe share your thoughts on the committee and how it's working, since you are its chairperson.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, it started really with an idea. So back a few years ago, a company was going around the country marketing an asset inventory tracking system to operators and regulators. And throughout that process, they started to realize that everybody had the same need, and that was, hey, tracking inventory is great, but it doesn't help a lot if I can't check my inventory against an approval database. As we all know in this, in the gaming environment, everything gets approved or you can't use it. So for regulators, it doesn't make sense to have inventory tracking without that second piece. Well, with the most jurisdictions now having multiple labs doing approvals, that piece becomes even more important. And so the idea was, hey, how can we easily get all of the approval information, no matter what the source is, no matter which lab it comes from, and get it into this one inventory tracking system, and be able to check all of our software, hardware, whatever the case may be, against the labs to make sure everything's been tested and approved. So with that idea, that company sort of put together a call with some of the regulators they had talked to, just to try and figure out, hey, what's the best way to go about maybe getting this done? And me, Todd, and some other regulators on that call had some previous experience working with GSA as advisory members for the GATT standard. And we thought that process went really well, had a great outcome. Now, if those of you that are familiar with the GATT protocol, we use it extensively here. I think Todd's using it extensively. So based on that experience, we thought, hey, let's pitch this idea to GSA to see what they think about maybe making it an open standard protocol that could be used throughout the industry. And from that, the committee was born. GSA was all on board, and they said, hey, we actually have a facility to host a committee of nothing but regulators, completely confidential. And we think this would be a great use of that committee. And we thought so too. And like I said, from that point on, we've had the RC committee. Some of the value that we get out of that, and some of the best value in it, is just the open dialogue that we can have as a group of regulators. So several of the conferences that are held around the country for gaming, a lot of those do, the host cities, the regulators there will sometimes have regulatory only meetings. And I personally find those very beneficial. And that's kind of what the RC committee is. It's just a place for a lot of us regulators to get on a call regularly. It's once a month, and just hash out ideas. Hey, this is what's going on in my jurisdiction. Or even if nothing's going on, just to throw ideas out. Hey, wouldn't it be great to do this? And just having other regulators there to bounce ideas off of and have that open dialogue in a confidential state is great. We do also have great access to industry experts, such as yourself, Mark, from the GSA, but also all of the GSA members, which are mostly made up of the manufacturers and vendors in the gaming industry. Their technical experts are essentially on other committees within GSA that we can send questions over to that are facilitated by GSA personnel. So having that access is really great to have. It really opens up a lot of doors. And we've had several ideas that came out of our regulatory committee that we've turned into standards since we started, CDI being one, the Windows directory hashing standard being another.
That's great. And Todd, I guess you represent the Missouri Gaming Commission on the same regulatory committee. So is it meeting your expectations? It seems like from what Chris just described, it's a great forum to have, open conversations and discussions between the regulators. And can you maybe share with me some ideas you might have as to how we could attract more regulators and maybe provide more value for participants in addition to you, Chris, and the other regulators that participate regularly?
Well, I think as a regulator, this is a great forum, like Chris said, to bring out your ideas. In fact, if you're using some of these protocols and you have better suggestions, like we talked about earlier before this call started about the different places are implementing CDI. If you have ideas that can make it better, this would be a great forum for you to bring and just discuss those. Participation from all the regulators makes sure that we have the best product out there. To touch off of Chris's comment with CDI, from a operational standpoint, back in the day before we had the inventory tracking systems, we would just go out and turn off gaming devices. Now with inventory tracking systems, we know exactly where they're at. And then we have additional elements we can put in there to make sure that those pay tables, if they're impacted, we just go out and option those pay tables off so the game stays up. So that's one of the operational impacts on that. So
that's great. Maybe moving on to something from the testing lab perspective. Travis, I'll pick on you first, if that's okay. So obviously BMM tests products around the world, and without necessarily naming companies, would you say that most of the major slot machine manufacturers have implemented, let's say, market-specific G2S functionality, or is that not really happening? And also, are you aware of other GSA standards that are being adopted?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's fair that the major manufacturers all have implemented some level of G2S. I mean, it's pretty, typical of new technology or new protocols in the gaming industry to take a while to really, get their footing and take off. G2S has been around for some time. I can remember back in the days when we did our first G2S casino floor. It was an interesting time, and it was around those times that there was a lot of ideas about what it could be used for. And most of the major manufacturers have implemented G2S to this point, at least the core, and some have done some extensions as well. But we still, there has been some definite successes with G2S. And, I think it's going to continue to grow. In some ways, it's a bit unfortunate that things do take a little while, and there's various reasons for that to be adopted. But I know there's a lot of concepts that people are talking about today that they would like to implement that are around COVID, and different things that you can do with new technologies to assist with social distancing, less contact, and all of those things a lot of them, I should say, could be done. And some of them, I think, could easily be implemented through standardized protocols like G2S. So I think it's great. And I think that with it being standardized and the support of the regulators to use standardized protocols, it allows for those solutions to be floor-wide and not be manufacturer-specific. So I think we're going to see, they have implemented it. The solutions to use the right on the back of those protocols, I think, have been somewhat, some successful, some not successful. I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward. As far as other protocols, I know I compliment Chris and Todd for CDI and GATT. Those are great examples, especially for regulators, on ways to make your job easier, make them simpler to do, much more efficient. And I applaud them for doing that. And it goes for a test lab as well. When there's standardization in those areas, it makes our jobs a lot easier. At times there may be some that want to do things that are proprietary, but when you do things that are proprietary and not open, it ends up being more expensive, more challenging, and so forth. So yes, there's quite a few of the protocols that are using. I'm definitely interested in CDI. The company that Chris mentioned earlier that was going around with an inventory solution. We were working with them to have the same idea. It needs to be an open protocol. So I'm glad that's been picked up and carried on through GSA.
And I think, Travis, to piggyback on your comment about COVID and technology, one of the things that we've been discussing within the GSA staff is specifically that is, what are the things that have been manually done on casino floors that as we now, are opening up again, and we've got casino employees that are, on the floor, and we've got regulatory agents that are on the floor. Is there technology that could be brought to bear to eliminate some of those touch points? And if there is, what is that technology, and how do we actually deploy it in a way that, again, kind of keeps people safe and continues to allow us to open the casinos, and I guess maybe more importantly, make sure that, if we have a really bad flu season, if we have a flu season coupled with maybe a resurgence of COVID, that we're not in a position where, God forbid, we have to start shutting down casinos again. So I think that idea of really using technology, I agree with you. I think it's really going to start picking up steam moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, just if I could touch on that real quick, Mark. I mean, I think there's two things immediately that you could do. I mean, obviously there's some steps to put it in place, but with the protocols themselves, eliminating the need for the technician to go to the machine to install new software, easy one, right?
Right.
You also have the ability for regulators, instead of, when I was in Nevada, we had to touch every machine to do inspections, inspecting those machines through the use of network GATT, right? You just eliminated those two situations that are common, where people are actually at the machine interacting with the public and touching the equipment, which they don't have to.
No, you're spot on. And again, in our first webinar, we had Canadian operators on the VLT side of the market that are using remote configuration and download extensively to do exactly that. Change games, change configurations, download software to build validators, printers, through the G2S and the GDS standards. They're doing it across multiple manufacturers. It's not like it used to be when we first did, remote configuration and download. It was, one manufacturer and only their games. So things have improved. And I think to your point, there will be more innovation, because I'm afraid that, while we're all talking about COVID now, and while, some say maybe it'll go away, and, I think it'll actually stick around for a while, maybe it'll be cyclical, but is this going to be the last one, or will there be, something else that, will show up down the pike? So technology is great. And so piggybacking on that, and talking about technology, Peter, I'll come to you. GLI, obviously, like BMM is a global independent test lab. You test products globally, and you actually have a history of helping regulators and the industry in general in terms of creating technical requirements. I think one of the get-togethers that Chris was talking about is the GLI roundtable that GLI hosts annually. So as innovation continues to occur within gaming, so what is your view with regards to how long older non-extensible communication protocols, I'll call them that, kind of can last versus newer ones such as G2S? I mean, you just heard we're talking about, leveraging technology more and more. If you've got something that's old that can't really be extended, how long is it going to stick around?
Yeah, so it's funny, I read this question and I thought back, 7-8 years ago when I'm sitting inside a cubicle testing machines, and the first mention that I've ever heard of G2S, for the Sweden market at the time. And I'm like, this is gonna take the industry by storm. And SAS is still around, and SAS is still present, and it's still meeting all the obligations regulators need for accounting meters and whatnot. But I think there's definite limitations on some of the communication protocols that are out there today. And as you guys spoke about, the new things they have for COVID, as far as turning off machines, or even some of the stuff that we're seeing as far as player identification and streaming stuff up to the cloud to get facial recognition or whatnot, or different methodologies that we're seeing that are getting brought into the casino floor, and the big need across all of, I think, technology-driven companies to collect big data and be able to analyze gameplay and really give the players what they want to play. I think you're going to eventually have to get to a point where you're going to have more robust communication protocols that can support that. And I couldn't agree more. And obviously, I'm not a regulator. I've never been a regulator, but I could see, with G2S, the ability to collect that information and be able to do the job probably a lot easier for the information you're collecting. Mark, you mentioned Canada. I mean, there's two markets in the U.S., Oregon and Illinois, that, the wide area markets. And I think they're definitely seeing, the upsides, the positives of not having to have field agents go to every single location that could be miles and miles and miles apart from one another to do RAM clears or to do, upgrades. And while casinos, maybe that wasn't always the case because you're in one location and it wasn't seen as that much of a pain point. I think in the world of COVID we live in now, and really trying to get the least amount of people to touch these machines as possible, I think you could see a progression to move towards a protocol like G2S quicker than sooner.
Yeah, and I guess to your point, and Todd and I have had this conversation numerous times. You've got to create a bridge from where you are today to where you want to get, because and maybe we'll talk about this later. Chris is in a newer jurisdiction. Todd in Missouri is in a jurisdiction that's been around for a long time. Chris, you're in New Jersey. Travis used to work in Nevada. I mean, these are older jurisdictions, well established. And so what you'll find is that casino floors and the products on casinos, have various ages and various capabilities. So you've got to sort of slowly, provide a migration point from where you are again to where you want to be. But to that point, and Chris, because you are in newer jurisdiction, one of the things I've been hearing, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that Ohio is seriously considering, requiring G2S. And if that's the case, can you explain why you think you would move in that direction?
Yeah, that is true. We are definitely considering making G2S a requirement for our gaming, as one of our gaming device standards. Primarily, we're looking at it mostly for the availability of all the granular data that it can provide. We're looking at updating our regulatory procedures to make it more automated and efficient. So as an example, real-time analysis of game performance at a wager category level, and having the ability to monitor that in real time and also disable the game if it starts to get out of skew with analytically where it should be based on its actual performance. Now, putting it out of service might be an extreme thought. There's going to be several steps, I'm sure, in there before something like that would happen. But at least could flag those games in real time for analysis or for further investigation. But also just what was mentioned earlier, the ability to validate and verify software remotely, and again, automated. G2S has the event categories that you can set up a verification to occur based on events that are happening at the machine. Anytime the power cycles or anytime the CPU door triggers an open signal or a close signal, hey, validate all the software in the machine, make sure it's still good and nothing's been tampered with, as well as pay table, like I said, pay table information, make sure it's all meeting the jurisdictional requirements and somebody didn't select a pay table that shouldn't have been selected. So that
go ahead, Todd, sorry.
Probably the primary reason that we're looking to go in that direction, because some of that's just not possible with SaaS. But then you also have the benefit of the security, right? So SaaS is unencrypted. It's just essentially plain text being sent over a wire, and it's scary how easy it is to manipulate that at the game level. And surprisingly, you haven't heard more about that being done in the field, but honestly, I don't know that some of the operators would ever know that it was being done based on some of the detail that they're not as detail oriented when it comes to monitoring game performance as they probably should be. We do have procedures, and I'm sure most regulators do have procedures that require them to analyze that stuff, but with the data that's available, they just can't, their hands are a little bit tied in how much they can monitor that and how closely they can monitor that stuff.
Chris is exactly right. Everyone's focused in on verifying the software, but that's only part of it. Following game performance to make sure that the game's operating the way it should. I can line up cases and cases of where the games were, all the software's fine, but then something goes wrong with it. We don't know what it is. And then all of a sudden, $170,000 later, nobody knows what happened. And having those fail safes, it would be amazing as a regulator, having all that information come in. And Chris is right. You should be able, the operator should run those reports, a negative win report or something along those lines, to track how these games are handling themselves.
I think your ex-colleague here is trying to make you a little jealous in Missouri because, you know, he can move over to G2S. So Todd, maybe you could share with us, look, you know, you're in a well-established jurisdiction. You've got long-established casinos. What are the major obstacles to doing the same thing as the Ohio Gaming Commission is looking to do?
Well, so I ran some numbers this morning, Mark, and this is kind of an indicator of where our jurisdiction sits. Of our over 16,000 games, 29% are non-GATT and 71% are GATTable games. So that gives me an indication of, generally speaking, of what my availability would be on the floor for a G2S type of game, albeit not completely accurate, but somewhat in the ballpark, because we keep inventory on that. And since we are a mature market, when you have a gaming device that is fully paid for and doesn't have that particular functionality, there tends to be a little bit of reluctance to pull those particular games away from the operator. So looking at a phased in approach for a G2S or something along those lines with like a lease product to traditional games might be the best way to handle it. I would like to have exactly what Chris stated, being able to track real gaming statistics and being able to flag those particular games that are under or overperforming either way. We do have a process in Missouri. It's very manual, where the operators have to go out twice a year and look at all their slot performance. If it's plus or minus 4%, they have to put it on a report and they submit that to us. So it's a very manual process, whereas Chris over there, he can very easily pull that up right then and there, and there's no reason to run that report.
So this is actually
it is a very beneficial process for us over here in Missouri.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Todd, but this is actually very interesting, and it sort of tees up the next question I've got really nicely. In that here we have two regulators that are talking about data, they're talking about security, they're talking about, you know, making sure that we're using communication protocols as tools, as enablers to get data to make sure that the gaming devices, in fact, are performing appropriately as they were intended to. Travis, you and BMM work very closely with regulatory bodies around the world. Do these topics like data security and data transparency and communication protocols, I mean, did they ever come up when you're talking technical requirements with regulators, or is that too low level? And if they do, what are some of the concerns, and how could GSA maybe facilitate those conversations?
Well, I'd say yes, they do come up, but not enough. Not enough. I think that you know, you have well-established jurisdictions, or jurisdictions like Missouri and Ohio and a lot of the commercial jurisdictions, that we do have those conversations, but it's still a pretty small minority. And I think part of that is that maybe they don't know what to ask. Maybe they don't have, you know, they don't understand. I mean, there's jurisdictions that are fortunate enough to have technical folks that can ask those questions, but there's quite a few that don't. And I think that with these topics like data security, data transparency, the communication protocols, those are things that change pretty quickly, right? I think that the days of us relying upon roundtables and panels at conferences to try and help educate, I think the current environment has demonstrated that there's a much better platform to be able to help communicate. And it's things like this webinar. You know, I think these are things that you know, GSA can help facilitate more of these. You know, when Chris and Todd talk about having a forum for regulators to discuss amongst themselves, you know, that's great. And GSA could facilitate that and bring in subject matter experts to help educate those tribes. We are, and I know GLI does as well, we do our own webinars. And what we found is that, you know, when you look at the conferences like G2E, you get a certain amount of regulators that come to that. There's quite a few regulators that don't come to that. And what we're seeing through these webinars, because now people are getting accustomed to doing them, you're getting a lot of regulators to participate that wouldn't normally travel. Maybe they don't have the budget and so forth. Mm-hmm. So hosting more of these types of things where we do get into specifics about the technology, the things that are going on, allow regulators to share the information about what they're seeing. I can speak to when I was a regulator, we used to have those kind of regulator only meetings, and you would sit there and everybody would talk about the issues that they're seeing, right? And as they're talking about what you realize is they all have the same issue. They're kind of looking at it a little bit differently. But as soon as we figure out that we're all talking about the same thing, you can make a lot of progress in trying to solve those issues and move forward. So GSA can help by continuing to do things like these webinars, for sure.
And I think, Peter, if I were to carry that question forward,
Sure.
obviously I mentioned the roundtable that GLI puts out. I know that you guys work very closely with regulators around the world as well. So in addition to what Travis just said, how can we as an industry better partner with regulators to jointly draft what I'll call, and I'm stealing this from the Canadian operators that shared this with me. How can we jointly draft a technology plan that really supports innovation, it supports competition, and more importantly, really provides regulators an improved ongoing oversight capability. So rather than having Todd be stuck, in a position where, look, he'd like to be able to implement G2S, but he can't. How can we as an industry, operators, suppliers, regulators, work together to say, in 5 years, in 10 years, here are the stepping stones that we're going to accomplish in order to achieve these sort of things? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a great question. And first of all, if Todd wanted to implement G2S, I know, Todd, you can do it. I know, man. Really, though, I couldn't agree more. As far as these webinars and GSA hosting this, and really just starting these discussion points out and getting really the interested parties involved. There definitely are. We deal with regulators across the globe. There are some that are more technical than others. There are some that are more interested in kind of getting involved in these. It's been my experience, and kind of go back to the other question a bit, as far as data protection, data integrity, and that always seems to come up when we talk about standards and technical requirements. The communication portion, maybe not so much. So as far as getting into the nitty gritty of G2S compared to SAS compared to whatever else it might be. I think there's good examples of almost, I don't want to say workshops, but basically taking a collection of industry, including regulators, suppliers, test labs. Anytime we update the GLI standards, we recently updated GLI 19 for internet gaming. We send that out to industry and we get feedback from regulators and suppliers across the globe. And, we realize we want to put together whatever's going to be tested against meets regulatory objectives, but also, stays efficient for industry and doesn't limit, innovation. Other things as of recent, I know the Canadian Gaming Association, they had, recently they put some cashless standards together in kind of response to COVID. So I think GSA can play a huge role there. I think the more of these types of webinars, the more of these types of trainings that get offered or whatnot, I think you'll start to see who the interested parties are, who really cares and wants to kind of grow and innovate and push industry along. And I think at that point, we just, we all get in a room and we kind of work it out together. We're all in this together, even though we have different, different facets in the gaming industry. So.
Yeah. And go ahead, Todd, sorry.
Well, I think there's a little bit of a fundamental difference here. If we're talking about gaming standards, that's in one bucket. If we're talking about the protocol to which they communicate and security, that may be a subset of a standard, but it doesn't explicitly say how that must be done. And that, I think, is a little bit what's different between that. And, listen to the discussion, perhaps, some regulatory jurisdiction sees this as an extension of suppliers. Well, I'm telling you, I have not interacted with a supplier on any of the CDI projects, or maybe back when we did GATT 3.5, but I've not seen interactions with the suppliers.
So basically what I'm hearing is that education is still critical in making sure that regulatory authorities, who might not all have the same capabilities from a technology perspective, because not all regulatory authorities have this, are of the same size and have the same budgets and staff, that is really still critical, and doing so in a way that does not require travel, makes things easy to understand, makes it information available and digestible. Those really are things that GSA could do, in addition to bringing people together to then hash out, here's what needs to be done, here's how you do it. Those are things that GSA could do to really move technology forward in the industry. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that's definitely great. I think if everything clears up and we have people have the ability to travel and people have the ability to feel safe and be in these types of conferences, I think that's a great venue as well. Just for the fact, sometimes you're in the room and you get to sit across from somebody, you get to bounce ideas off each other. Compared to a 1 hour webinar, you might talk through some things as well. But in the world we live in today, I think we have to almost be innovative ourselves and find ways to get the information out to the masses. And I think things like these are just, incredible for that.
Yeah, and if nothing else, right, this tees up a conversation. It sparks some thought. And if people want to follow up and learn more, obviously we're all available, and we're just one camera call away, so to speak. We've talked a lot about CDI, about the certification database interface. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but again, as you guys explained, that was developed directly at the request of the regulatory committee. I know Ohio Casino Commission is one of a handful of regulators out there that have implemented it. And I know it's supported by both GLI and BMM. So my question, Chris, as the chair of the regulatory committee, and as one regulatory authority using CDI, you touched on the value of it. Why do you think other regulators aren't using it, and what can we do to sort of drive adoption?
If you don't mind, just as you stated and I stated earlier, CDI was not developed in the regulatory committee per se, but the idea was kind of born there. Mm-hmm. And one thing I just wanted to throw out there, the regulatory committee isn't technical in nature, and for some of the regulators out there that may not have that technical staff available to them, the regulatory committee isn't that technical in nature, and really you don't have to be a technical person to be involved with it. Like I said, it's mostly idea sharing, and a lot of the actual protocol writing and that type of stuff is a sort of a joint venture between the regulatory committee and the actual technical committees within GSA. So I just want to make sure nobody out there thinks that, hey, we don't have technical staff, we can't really participate in that. That's definitely not the case. Like I said, idea sharing, just being part of the conversation and having everybody's input on what needs to be in protocol just from a really high level is hugely beneficial and makes the standards and the ideas that we do come up with that much more useful for everyone. But to CDI specifically, yeah, the value there for us was, although as I stated earlier, the company that had that inventory tracking software, we didn't purchase that. We don't use that. We have an in-house built system that tracks all of that information. However, we had the same problem that they and any other inventory tracking system had. We needed an efficient way to get all of the data that we needed into one location, and CDI was what we needed, and that's what we came up with. And it's been a huge value for us, mostly in the fact that the way that we were doing it before, we were very limited on the data that we could get because we were doing it through flat file transfers. And so the limited data set was problematic because we wanted to, again, start moving forward into more of the automated systems and really take advantage of some of the efficiencies that come with having that additional data. And so for us, it was sort of a staged plan of, hey, let's get all of the data we need. CDI was the protocol that we needed to do that. So now, instead of just component information and signatures and approval status, we get all of the ancillary data that comes with those submissions, pay table information. We have direct access to any notes and reports from the testing labs on each individual component that happens. So now that we have that data, we start moving into that other stage of, hey, now let's get the the real-time data from the games, and now we have something to compare it to. So we're kind of in that process right now, as we said earlier, of moving into that G2S realm of, hey, let's get the data. We have the known good data now from the labs through CDI. Let's move on to that next phase. But that's where the value really came for us in CDI, was the ability to get all of that data, that massive data set that just wasn't able to be done through a flat file transfer.
So what can we do to get more regulators to adopt it? Is it a technology issue, you think? Is it more of an education issue? What are your thoughts?
I think based on the current status of things, a lot of regulators are getting what they need right now through whatever form they have. But I think it'll start to come to light that, hey, as we need more, we're just not able to get it in the current fashion. So I think as that starts to proliferate throughout the jurisdictions, that CDI does become more and more attractive in those realms. And there is a little bit of a technical component to that, because you do have to have an endpoint that will to pull that information in, that has to be compatible with it. But definitely the labs, all the ones that we work with support it on their end. It's just having an endpoint on the regulator end to pull that information in.
And then I'll just add one more thing about the regulatory committee. It is free to join, so there's no cost for regulators to participate in that regulatory committee. So in addition to not needing to be technical, it is free to join. And one more thing on CDI, it doesn't just do the submission and approvals of products. It can also be used to do machine move submissions, for example, for regulators that are still using that capability or require that. It could also be used for approval to ship processes. And I know the AGA has tried to solve the whole approval to ship process. We had a blockchain-based seminar that we did in Reno 2 years ago, where a number of companies, Cisco, Intel, Oracle, shared with us some blockchain-based solutions that could be applicable to approval to ship. So these are all issues that affect all of us, and discussing them in the regulatory committee and maybe coming up with a new way of doing things is great.
And Mark, to go off that, not only it does the shipping, but with AGA's reform, they wanted to ship the games fully burdened, meaning with all the software on them. So back in the day when we had EPROMs and things along those lines, we would there's a possibility that they could have got burned up. But with GATT and the shipping fully assembled, we're seeing a positive improvement on reliability at the casino floors as well when they're installing these products.
Yeah, and sort of staying with you, Todd, and I know we've touched on this throughout this conversation, but G2S can provide a lot of functionality, right? Remote software validation, as you said, it even does it off of events, and the moment a machine pops up, it can do the authentication and won't even let the machine become playable if it fails that authentication. It provides all of the meter and the event data at a very granular level, as Chris indicated. It generates, remote device disable functionality that's true remote disable. Is that enough for regulators to mandate G2S? And if not, sort of what would cause that tipping point? Is there such a thing?
It goes back to removing legacy products. We just don't have an appetite to do that right now. Those are very profitable games. The hybrid approach I could envision with lease products, something along those lines. And, if suppliers were to move in the direction of working with the casinos, implementing some type of hybrid approach with G2S, then this agency would have to reevaluate some of our legacy approaches to handling authentication and things along those lines. So.
And I guess following up from that, right, one of the other issues that we haven't talked about yet is that G2S is a networked protocol and therefore requires a network, a true Ethernet network. Older casinos and maybe even some riverboats don't have networks. So if there's a way to implement a hybrid approach. We've talked in the conversations about operating systems inside of a slot machine that support the SAS communication protocol alongside the G2S communication protocol. Do you think using wireless for non-critical regulatory required communications for G2S? So in other words, the CMS is still talking to a SMIB, talking to a slot machine in SAS, and all of that reporting and monitoring is happening from that perspective untouched. But now you've got a G2S component with that slot machine, and now you could talk wireless to some other host, maybe to do remote configuration and download, maybe to do CDI, maybe to do remote GATT, or all of that functionality. Is that something that you all, and anybody can answer this, but do you think that's something feasible, or do you think that there are significant regulatory hurdles that we'd have to overcome?
First of all, I'd want to know what your definition of non-regulated purpose was. If we're talking game performance meters, I think that would be reasonable. There's an added value for the operators, the suppliers, and the regulators for something like that. I would like to see a white paper on that and see how it particularly functions and what's considered regulated and non-regulated.
Cool, that's great. Anybody else?
I can chime in a bit here. So we've had a lot of, myself personally, extensive conversations with regulators across, specifically North America, just for the point of this conversation, with wireless. And wireless has always been one of those, touchy conversations where, they want to make sure there's enough security in place. You'd obviously have to, upgrade, the different setups that you have within the property or whatnot, and make sure all, the appropriate measures are in place to protect the information. Nobody could snoop on it. It's interesting though, with PASPA being repealed, and then now with some states coming on board with internet gaming, I think that's opening up some, and we're starting to see concepts more like true thin client devices, or, concepts reviews that we're looking at where maybe on the floor, it's almost like iGaming on the floor. It's essentially, a device that's connected via Ethernet or via wireless, and regulators seem more apt to talk about this technology now, and it's almost like a follow through because iGaming is kind of becoming more streamlined or whatnot. Now that said, I still think the number one question that we get as a lab would still be: is it secure? Is it protected? What type of means is it communicating, and how is that being handled? And I think as long as all of those were met, you would definitely have, I think multiple markets in the U.S. would be interested at least hearing about it, like Todd said, with a white paper, or other markets that I talked to, I think they'd be interested in hearing about it.
Great, you guys gave me more work to do.
Is that bi-directional communication, or is it one directional, which is the big one?
All right. I'll take that on and I'll write something, and if you don't mind, I'll pass to you guys first and get your input before we put it out for broader consumption. But piggybacking on something, Peter, that you just said, and you mentioned, iGaming is becoming more prevalent. Obviously, we've got sports betting all over the place. We've got iGaming in terms of online casino happening in some states within the US. In Europe, it's huge in other areas of the world. We also have been talking about GATT and network GATT to ensure that, the software within slot machines is authenticated. We know that it's right. It's an exact copy of what was submitted to labs and was approved. What are your thoughts on how that is being done in the online space? How if somebody says, is gaming in a slot machine fair? We would all say absolutely, because we know we can authenticate the software. We know we do hashes. We know we can compare one hash to what's running in the slot machine and say, this is the same thing. How are we doing that? How would we answer that question in the online space?
Yeah, so I'm going to be greedy, and I'll start off, and I'll let the rest of the panelists kind of chime in. So online and sports betting for sure, any type of mobile type gaming device, there are measures to validate the software. It's built within technical requirements, whether it be jurisdictional requirements, whether it be the GLI standards for those types of devices. But there's means in place to validate signatures. Now, the difference with any type of mobile device, whether it's an app on your phone, whether it's gambling or Netflix, or buying off of Amazon, is there's a big push to be able to update that software very frequently. You really have to look at the end user's experience, and and suppliers and industry really want to be able to make changes on the go as they see fit. So while there are measures in place to validate software, that signature might change 2 days after it's installed or 3 days after it's installed. So to meet those obligations, there's a couple things in place for these types of systems. From the operations side, regulators across the globe have adopted some form of change management process to basically, get a full understanding of every change that gets made from the operator, from the supplier side, audit that to ensure that it meets the expectations of how they would classify each of those changes, and then maybe require testing on certain situations. If you're updating something that really is tied to something regulatory in nature, maybe it has to go through the test lab first. Other measures that are in place is most of these systems have some form of, daily routine that runs that validates to see if the signatures have changed since the last time it ran, and then it'll notify the regulator, almost similar to network GATT, when that component has changed. So really, it's a different way to regulate and a different way to get that information, but the tools are still there. They still exist. It's just some of them are operational compared to fully technical.
Anybody else? All right, I think you've addressed that one fully there, Peter. Thank you. Maybe I'll ask this question. One of the standards that GSA has created is the regulatory reporting interface, and really it is a methodology for online components, be it an internet gaming platform or a remote gaming server, the content and the platform side, how they communicate information to regulators. And one of the reasons why we came up with RRI is because globally, regulators are being asked to provide oversight to traditional land-based casinos, as well as to new online ones. And as you know, those systems, as you just described, Peter, those systems are very different. The way they operate is very different. So, do you think that as in North America, sports betting continues to proliferate, as online casino hopefully will pick up right after that? Is this something that you believe will add value to regulators who are going to have to contend with data reporting from those very different systems? What do you guys think?
Well, I guess, Mark, your question is, I think anytime that people are being introduced with new technology or new platforms for wagering that they regulate, having the availability for information to be made available to them in a standardized way is always going to be a bonus on that, right? So if you're deploying multiple systems, it's, instead of having to do, and I think maybe Todd mentioned it earlier, a different way or maybe you did, a different way to do your job is dependent upon the provider, is always a challenge, right? So having a standardization that allows you to collect information and get that reporting the same way from everybody is super important, I think.
Yeah, and I guess sort of to expound on that a little bit, you've got land-based operations that traditionally go, CMS centric and then reporting to the regulators. You've got online where with online, it's all about data, and there's so much data that is generated. I mean, think about, every single online casino handle pull, every single, poker hand dealt, every transaction that happens from every player. I mean, you got so much data coming at you that if you're trying to do anti-money laundering, if you're trying to do proper responsible gaming and player protection, you've got to analyze all of this data. I think you said it, Travis, unless you've got a standardized way for this data to come in, you're not going to be able to deal with it. And, one of the reasons why we started working on the regulatory reporting interface was specifically because of those challenges. I will tell you that for the past 2.5 years, I've been working with the European Commission and the European Committee for Standardization in Europe, specifically on creating a pan-European voluntary standard for reporting, because the European Commission asked the expert group on gambling to do a study on whether having a standard reporting mechanism would actually add value. And what that expert group, which was comprised of regulatory authorities from around Europe, said absolutely we would need this, because it would help how information comes into the regulators, but it also would help regulators share information across regulatory jurisdictions. So the idea of having standards and a standardized data feed, it seems to make sense. One of the challenges that we might have, maybe this is a North American centric problem, is that I don't know how much conversation there is amongst the regulators who are adopting online gaming requirements, how much conversation there is on these sort of things. I think especially now in post-COVID or during COVID, with all of the shutdowns and the reductions in tax revenues that jurisdictions have had as they move forward aggressively, is now the time to be having these conversations? And if so, is that again another situation where these kind of webinars or bringing regulators together in a regulatory committee type environment the right way to go? Does that make sense to you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
with the RRI and the having the data immediately available in a standardized format sure would be helpful. We deal in an environment where we're reactive or after the event's already occurred, and it's more difficult to gather the data. So having a setup like Chris, where he could get the data right there and flag everything, would definitely solve a lot of the problems that we have in our jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think you just have to be.
You can still get it. It's just post hard.
I think you just have to be careful with because I think data in one format it sounds great, and it obviously would make everybody's lives a lot easier. When we put together the GLI standard, GLI 33 or GLI 19, we really focus on the data being available in the system, because in our experience, different regulators might be using that data a little bit differently or have their own kind of needs for that. So we're not as prescriptive how it has to format out. And a big reason of that as well is, feedback we've gotten from industry where now, the way I'm doing, I think is just totally fine. Why do I have to reinvent it? So I think as long as it's, the data is collected and not necessarily mandated, it has to go a certain way. I think that's probably the better direction to go. That'd just be my take.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that we wanted to avoid with RRI along those lines, Peter, is that we didn't want the suppliers to have to reinvent their tool because they got licensed from one jurisdiction to another. Yeah. So having a standard way of providing the data and then letting the regulatory authorities, slice and dice and format the data any which way they wanted, to your point, to their requirements, and giving them that flexibility, really sort of seemed to be the sweet spot. Anyway, sorry, Todd.
I said that makes sense.
Yep. So gentlemen, we've got about 3 minutes. I think the questions that came across, we've sort of addressed as we were going through this webinar. I really wanted to thank you very much for your participation. As I mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for reviewing or downloading from the IGSA.org website. Just go to the main page, click on that YouTube link, and then you'll see all the webinars there, as well as the other YouTube conversations that we've recorded in the past. So to our audience, I want to say thank you very much for your participation and listening in and your questions. And to our panelists, again, thank you very much. And I'll work on a white paper and share it with you guys first and get your thoughts. So with that, thank you very much, gentlemen, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.